In the beginning was the image, and through the inventions of man and the wonders of science, the image was allowed to move. Newspapermen declared it a modern miracle, and the public clamored for a glimpse of this marvelous turn-of-the-century phenomenon. But in time, the illusion of life was no longer capable of astounding the viewer. So the creators of these earthly wonders began to intensify their effect. Instead of the illusion of life, they created the illusion of death. At the same time that they glorified life with dancing women, scenic vistas, and simple narratives, turn-of-the-century filmmakers struggled to express something more dark and fierce within their lives. Not all early silent films are quaint and whimsical. In this film by Georges Méliès, the audience sits helpless as they watch a band of criminals lay siege to a country house. More than 90 years have passed since it was made, but its impact has not softened. Behold the face of horror. Behold the birth of cinema. Welcome to the kingdom of shadows. In its early incarnations, horror was often played for laughs, as in this 1897 Lumiere short. Death also appeared in fanciful jest or in more naturalistic settings. As films grew in length and complexity, filmmakers began to delve beyond the simulation of death to explore the substance of our fears to the very source of evil. The original battle between good and evil for the soul of man was the Big Bang that sparked the universe of horror. From this primordial conflict came the idea of salvation as well as the threat of damnation. Ironically, our concepts of death and transgression arise from biblical teachings of life and virtue. Religious imagery is a recurring element of the early horror film, an ominous reminder of the darkness just around life's corner, a thin shield against more diabolical forces. Before the modern vampire film, the crucifix becomes a means of warding off evil. And even when evil takes the form of a young monk, as in this 1921 film by the great Scandinavian director Carl Dreyer. The crucifix is a talisman, like the four-leaf clover that protects a pair of young lovers from an evil witch in this 1903 Méliès short. Religion is our connection to salvation, yet it binds us to the idea of death and eternal punishment, a quandary that has tormented the mind and fueled the dark imaginations for centuries. The religious symbols are not always Christian. In The Student of Prague, a man is stalked by his evil twin through a Jewish cemetery, while in the Golem, a Talmudic rabbi summons spiritual forces to save his people from persecution. The creation sequence has become the most dazzling set piece of monster films, and the Golem set a standard that was followed for years. The boundary between religious drama and horror film is not always clear. Six years later, F.W. Murnau quite literally reenacted this scene with one significant variation. Rather than raising a beast in the name of God, the scientist Faust invokes the name of the devil to bring aid to his people. A year later, Fritz Lang would in turn borrow from Faust for the creation sequence of Metropolis. There is a sense in these films that good's proximity to evil has jeopardized our well-being, that by offering us salvation, religion has exposed us to sin and rendered us vulnerable to corruption. Those who stridently defend their virtues seem to be at greatest risk, unhinged by their zealousness, allowed to more easily cross over into the shadow kingdom. In this scene from Carl Dreyer's film, Leaves from Satan's Book, the devil watches as a young monk's forbidden desires seep into his religious practices. There has always been, and there continues to be, a popular fascination with the sexual habits of those committed to celibacy. In many fictional accounts, these repressed desires ultimately surface in deviant forms. The moments of unconscious sexual relief found in Benjamin Christensen's Witchcraft Through the Ages are acts of sadomasochism that would make the Marquis de Sade dance in pleasure. By superimposing a close-up of the flagellant's face, a face that could be reacting in torturous pain or orgasmic pleasure, Christensen keeps us guessing about the true meaning of the man's religious zeal. With the holy tools that more closely resemble the devices of a modern-day psychopath, the religious establishment gained obedience and faith through force. Once the horrors of the Inquisition were safely in the past, writers of fiction frequently turned to its union of religion and sadism as a source of dreadful, frightening entertainment. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, based on the novel by Victor Hugo, has much to satisfy the public's appetite for the grotesque. In Joan the Woman, which recounts the trial of Joan of Arc, Cecil B. DeMille carries the horrors of the Inquisition to gruesome extremes. The costumes of the religious order transformed into images of horror. In The Pit and the Pendulum, Edgar Allan Poe wrote, "Of the dungeons, there are strange things narrated. Fables, I have always deemed them, but yes, strange, and too ghastly to repeat, save in a whisper." To the victims of its tyranny, there was the choice of death with its physical agonies, or death with its most hideous moral horrors. Bearing the substance of Victorian literature, as often it would, the early horror film frequently conjured visions of the holy torture chamber. In doing so, filmmakers evoke sensations more deeply unsettling than mere shock. Viewers experience fear mingled with religious guilt, fear based on actual occurrences, the uneasy fear that religion at its core is inseparable from evil. That the church, which promises salvation, could be one's downfall. Leaves from Satan's book makes the connection between God and devil even more explicit. In this film, the claws of Satan are likened to the tools of the Inquisitor. By assuming authority over God's dominion, the Inquisitors became monsters. In the 19th century, once the Inquisition had faded from memory, literature found a more contemporary counterpart to the spiritual sadist of the Middle Ages. The man of modern science. At the dawn of the 20th century, science was viewed with some skepticism as it attempted to solve the mysteries of human life previously considered beyond mankind's understanding and authority. One of the most popular and significant tales of science's intrusion into the holy realms was Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, first published in 1886, translated to film in 1908, 1909, and 1911. Shown here starring James Cruise, who would later become a major director in Hollywood. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was filmed twice more in 1913 and twice again in 1920. One version starred Sheldon Lewis, pictured here. In every version, evil is unleashed when a scientist like a zealous inquisitor crosses a moral boundary and dares to take God's laws into his own hands. God and the devil indeed, driven more by his raw curiosity than the high-minded Hippocratic oath, Jekyll willfully becomes devil for the day. And we discover that beneath the educated exterior of this visionary scientist lurk the darkest desires of the common animal. The scientist vows summon the dark spirit of Mephisto from the bowels of hell, while this new breed of scientist invokes the evil that lies within himself. This best-known silent version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde stars the great John Barrymore as Stevenson's errant man of science. Even as it supports the idea of evolution, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde serves as a warning against tampering with God's design. This word monster comes from the Latin word monstrum, meaning divine warning. Thus, the appearance of Hyde is a sign from God showing the consequence of Jekyll's transgression. But even as Jekyll's fall from grace teaches the viewer a moral lesson, it also allows us the rare opportunity to enjoy our own darkest fantasies. And yet, we can be confident that order will be restored to God's universe in the end, and our consciences white clean. During those minutes when he haunts the slums of London, our imaginations are allowed to run wild, and our darkest curiosities are indulged. The monsters of today are the doctors of our past, owing a debt of origin to the medical practices of the Dark Ages. Bloodletting and blood-sucking were the practice of healers, making them the vampires, so to speak, of their age. exorcism was a common treatment of disease, and the mystical healers of old Russia were known as Volkhova, or wolfmen. In its infancy, medicine was something to be feared, with some devices resembling the tools of torture rather than the instruments of healing. Although their intentions were often noble, there was something profane about the zeal with which doctors and medical students experimented upon the flesh. In the 18th and 19th century, in Europe and the United States, body snatchers, ironically calling themselves resurrectionists, robbed the graves of the freshly buried to advance their skills, and earned a place in the pantheon of horror and the macabre. They were no ordinary ghouls. They unearthed the dead in the name of God and in the name of science. Although times changed and science grew more sophisticated, medicine still carried the stigma of witchcraft and sadism. Even when its sorcery was performed in a sterile operating theater. Published in 1818, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein brilliantly captured the horrors science was capable of producing. The curse that comes with wisdom is explored in the earliest films, such as this scientific nightmare by George Méliès, in which demonic spirits rise from the books, cabinets, and equipment with which the scientist explores life's mysteries, monsters issuing their warnings against gaining too much independence from God. In 1920, when Paul Wegener wrote, directed, and starred in The Golem, the Frankenstein myth was fully realized on screen. The formula would be repeated for decades, from James Whale's Frankenstein to Hammer horrors to the Cold War sci-fi thrillers of the 1950s. A lumbering monster is created. It seems unstoppable, and it reduces the world around it to fiery chaos, a veritable hell on earth. The monster poses a threat to the innocent, specifically to the virginal woman whose fear is both titillating and horrifying. Just as we identified with Mr. Hyde's mania, we identify with the innocent maiden being assaulted. The monster develops a will of its own and rebels against its creator, and destruction follows in its wake. fate of the beauty lies in the hands of the beast, and ultimately we learn that the monster has a heart after all, and was only misunderstood by the world. The mad scientist quickly became a fixture of the genre, with his castle laboratory and sterile operating chamber. In 1925, the Mad Doctor was already being parodied, as in The Monster, starring Lon Chaney. In the sound era, the screen was flooded with them.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Dr. Miracle, Dr. Moreau, Dr. X, Dr. Gogol, just to name a few. One of the most fascinating and potentially terrifying branches of science deals not with the flesh, but the intangible realm of the mind, the final frontier of the human body. Needless to say, this sacred domain, this last Pandora's box of human curiosity, soon became a cornerstone for the early horror film. As mankind learned more about this ultimate mystery, as scientists such as Sigmund Freud deconstructed the mind and brought its functions to our understanding, the new field of psychiatry became another variety of moral transgression. A new sacrilege worthy of punishment. This remarkable film, directed by D.W. Griffith in 1913, presents a basic understanding of psychological medicine and a sympathetic view of the mentally ill. Yet it exploits our worst fears of insanity run rampant. Loose on the grounds of a sanitarium, a disturbed man wanders to a nearby home. In the Griffith tradition, a Victorian woman, virginal and innocent, becomes the potential victim of a more modern terror, the psychotic monster who dominates contemporary horror films from Halloween to the frightening The Silence of the Lambs. Of all the manifestations of mental illness depicted on the screen, the one which seemed to hold the most dramatic value was sleepwalking. Filmmakers discovered something inherently terrifying in the loss of control of one's body, when the unconscious mind rebels against reason and leads the sleepwalker into the shadow kingdom. Unable to control our minds and our bodies in sleep, we become vulnerable, susceptible to frightening impulses that lurk within all of us. Just as Jekyll cannot suppress Hyde, the Freudian ego cannot control the id when the mind is numbed by sleep. The slow, seemingly blind pace of the sleepwalker soon becomes the walk of the undead. When zombies later appeared on the screen, they shared the gradual shuffling step of the silent movie somnambulous, creatures guided by impulse rather than reason. Complicating an already mystifying phenomenon is the premise that the sleepwalker is not even being controlled by his or her subconscious mind, but is responding to the hypnotic command of more diabolical forces. Sleep becomes a channel of communication through which Satan can do his bidding. It is interesting to note that in almost all early horror films, the sleepwalkers are women. This is less a reflection of women's weaknesses than a revelation of man's fears. The sleepwalking virgin is a symptom of male paranoia, that its women will shed their social conditioning, escape the father and the husband's command, that women will gain a kind of independence and follow their deepest libidinal desires, or else be manipulated by a darker outside force. Horror films of the silent era and the uncanny literature that came before it offered thinly disguised, sometimes mutated reflections of the sexual politics of their day. This establishes a common ground between the disturbed viewer and the horrors on the screen, as sex is stripped of romance and made monstrous, and our worst sexual fears are realized. In the Swedish film Witchcraft Through the Ages, a woman impregnated by the devil gives birth to a brood of demons 46 years before Rosemary's Baby dared to realize such a horror. In the kingdom of shadows, sex and horror are often inseparable, as in Arthur Robeson's expressionistic classic Warning Shadows, which offers a prolonged ballet of sexual assault, as a woman is stalked through a mansion by ominous, shadowy figures. The sexual undertones of the scene are emphasized in the way the aggressor's sword hangs limply at his side once his bloodlust has been quenched. Later we discover the entire incident was a dream, induced by a sinister hypnotist in the sleepy minds of a group of dinner guests. Even if one doesn't walk in one's sleep, even if one is not subjected to hypnosis, the curtain of sleep can part and reveal the many horrors of the Shadow Kingdom. Sitting in the movie theater in the sheltering darkness, we mimic the stasis of sleep. quiet, motionless, afraid, the closest we can get to death without committing ourselves to it entirely. So we enter the theater with one foot in the grave, and we open our eyes and wait for the nightmare to begin. And quite often, it does. Some of silent horror's most disturbing moments are those in which the sanctuary of sleep is violated. Violated by creeping nightmares made flesh. Violated by that which we cannot control, violated by aberrations of the tormented mind, invaded by the spirit that lurks in the shadows beyond the window. The spirit which creeps uninvited to the bedside. Which transforms a quiet slumber into a waking nightmare. This universal nightmare has been frequently reenacted through the years, sometimes with little variation. It was through this kind of repetition and modification that the timeless elements of the horror film were established. Some ingredients remain for years. Others have been replaced by more modern terrors. When filmmakers sought to bring a chill to the screen, they frequently turned to the works of Edgar Allan Poe, who captured Victorian America's fascination with the macabre. His works reflected dreaded fears mingled with forbidden desires, morbid sexuality, loss of control, a leap into the abyss of madness. In the development of the horror film, Poe's work was adapted more than any other author's. Perhaps one reason Poe's work is so popular is that it defies literal translation to the screen and therefore requires or allows free elaboration. It encourages writers and directors to find new ways to depict the subtleties of the mind and all the horrors it creates. Poe's ideas could be suggested through powerful visual metaphors. The horrors of Poe's writings could also be depicted in elaborate nightmare sequences. Since Poe's life was almost as tragic as his work, filmmakers occasionally blended fact with fiction. Such is the case with The Raven, a remarkable 1912 film that dramatizes the unfortunate death of Poe's wife. And in a somewhat heavy-handed manner, the writer's own struggle with alcohol. The Raven further fictionalizes Poe's life by introducing elements of his story, William Wilson, in which he is confronted by his own diabolical twin over a game of cards. A scene which was later used in the German adaptation and with slight variation in the film The Bells, in which Lionel Barrymore plays cards with the spirit of the man he has murdered. A scene which owes its origin not to Poe's original poem, but the various film versions of the author's work. Pioneering filmmaker D.W. Griffith was especially fond of Poe's work. In The Avenging Conscience, Henry B. Walthall is kept from marrying his sweetheart by his overbearing uncle and is finally driven to murder the old man. A sinister Italian immigrant spies the murder, and we reluctantly share in his devious, voyeuristic pleasure. The young man and his bride-to-be are at first happy, but are soon haunted by the specter of the one-eyed man. The deranged clerk is sent to a sanitarium, but the cure has little effect. Eventually, both he and his bride are driven far beyond insanity by the guilt or by the avenging conscience. Their tormented minds lead each of them to their own grisly demise, which Griffith dramatizes with his usual melodramatic abandon, relishing the gruesome details of the suicidal lovers' deaths. The most frightening aspect of Poe's work especially at a time when the public was just learning about mental illness and psychiatric medicine, was that the mind could unleash horrors upon the body, an idea brought to the screen in a picture called The Student of Prague, based on Poe's story, William Wilson. When Freud's colleague Otto Rank pronounced his theory of the doppelganger, or the phantom twin, he began with an analysis of this very film, which is proof of Poe's lasting influence and the growing cultural impact of the horror film. Some studios attempted to explain the complex logic behind these twisted narratives with words. But words only got in the way of the primitive fears Poe was tapping into. Visualizing the mindset of the mentally deranged was one of the greatest challenges to filmmakers of the silent era. By experimenting with visual representation of minds warped by madness, they found themselves discovering new realms of cinematic possibilities. With double exposure and other effects, the mind of the maniac was powerfully rendered on the screen. No longer were they telling stories of insanity. They were imposing a kind of cinematic insanity upon the mind of the viewer. No one succeeded better in recreating the landscape of insanity on film than the German expressionists, and no film better captured the effect of Robert Wiene's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is told through the eyes of a patient in a mental hospital. Rather than suggesting shadows through careful lighting, designers rendered them with wood and paint. The sleeping Caesar is like a shadow made flesh as he glides into the bedroom of his next victim. Shadows, more than any other visual ingredient, became the most effective device for inducing horror. The unknown, a void which cannot be seen, cannot be illuminated. Shadows are a psychological no man's land, the abyss of Poe's fiction, the unknowable corners of the human soul. Therein lie the mysteries of life and death. When shadows assume human form, they become stalking figures to haunt the frightened soul. In time, the Germans experimented with other camera effects, as in one of the earliest vampire films, F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu. The film employs fast motion effects to give the vampire an insect-like appearance. Nosferatu also uses the negative image to depict the Count's spectral carriage. Sometimes an imaginative composition is even more powerful than special effects, as when the vampire assumes a spidery pose against the ship's web-like rigging. Other countries followed Germany's lead, and the horror film soon became the domain of cinema's boldest experimentation. In this French adaptation of Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, oblique compositions, unconventional sets, and subtle camera effects beautifully enhance this sequence in which a man escorts his beloved to the tomb. Produced in Denmark in 1932, Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampire might be considered the last great silent horror film. Though it was made with sound, its impact is primarily visual, with the sound acting as a hushed, almost subconscious accompaniment to Dreyer's remarkably chilling imagery and prolonged passages of icy silence. At the climax of the film, the young protagonist witnesses his own death and burial. Even with digital sound, widescreen color, and computer-generated effects, few, if any, filmmakers since have approached the intensity of Dreyer's Vampire. Even though American studios took notice of the expressionistic style, it wasn't until numerous German filmmakers emigrated to the United States that the expressionist influence was strongly felt in American film. By the late 1920s, F.W. Murnau, Karl Freund, Edgar Ulmer, Conrad Veidt, Emil Jannings, and Paul Lenny, pictured here with the cast and crew of The Cat and the Canary, were plying their sinister trades at Fox Studio and Universal Studio. And they, perhaps more than any other artist, defined the visual style of cinematic horror as well as film noir, which borrowed many conventions of the horror film. Before coming to America, Paul Lenny directed Waxworks. This was an anthology film about the diabolical figures in a wax museum. And although surviving prints are in less than perfect condition, the frightening power of Lenny's vision shines through. In this sequence, sleep again provides the passageway for evil to enter a person's life. And a young writer finds himself and his lover pursued by Jack the Ripper through a nightmare carnival. No longer satisfied with painted, distorted sets, Lenny fractured space and created a psychological chaos by layering the image through elaborate double exposures. We see the couple is caught not only in a maze of a carnival midway, but lost in the fractured corridors of a mind deranged by fear. Once a place of casual amusement, the carnival becomes a world of never-ending horror. Carnivals, circuses, and other places of amusement serve as recurrent settings for horror in world cinema. Now the question is, how have places of such innocent fun been transformed into settings of unmitigated dread? The secret of the circus of horrors lies in the origin of the modern-day carnival. Their earliest ancestor was the traveling medicine show, usually presided over by a mountebank. Dr. Caligari, for example. The term mountebank means he who stands on a platform, since that is generally how the mysterious showman addressed the crowd. Claiming to offer the remedy to every ill, the solution to all life's dilemmas, the mountebank was a cross between a doctor and a fortune-teller. He was an ominous figure who embodied the mysteries of religion and science, the corrupt monk, Faust, Dr. Jekyll, and Sigmund Freud rolled into one. The German expressionist influence upon this American film is obvious, for Boris Karloff is outfitted in a costume identical to that of Werner Krauss in Caligari. The carnival was like a cathedral, like a laboratory, a place of mystery and discovery. An American director, Todd Browning, was especially drawn to popular amusements as places that cloak uncanny mysteries and horrors. The torture dungeon of a wax museum, a palace of illusions, the circus, the music hall, and a freak show, places where the odd and irregular are put on display. In Wallace Wordsley's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the carnival is a place of revelry, where death is marked and the libidinal pleasures forbidden by the church can be recklessly indulged, where monstrosity is not only displayed, but celebrated. Display is the key to monstrosity. A monster is not a monster unless it is put on exhibit and serves some illustrative or symbolic purpose. The word monster comes from the Latin word monstrum, meaning divine warning. It also has its origins in the Latin monstrare and the French word montrer, which in English means to show or demonstrate. Thus, a monster is not just something grotesque. It's a warning exhibited so that a lesson can be learned. During wartime, they villainized the political leaders of opposing countries. In Frankenstein, Dracula, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the three definitive monster fables, the creatures suggest the failures of science and man's defiance of God's laws. They foreshadow the decay of the grave. They speak of the animal within. They are the malformed psyche made flesh. They are chaos, that which cannot be controlled. They are social deviants incarnate. When humans rebel, monsters are born. Adam and Eve's rebellion began sin. When the inquisitors corrupted their religious authority, they became monsters. When scientists overstep their moral boundaries, when the mind deviates from sanity, monsters are born. Why? To scare us back to the straight and narrow path. The first actor to personify monstrosity in the horror film was Lon Chaney, who drastically altered his appearance with elaborate makeup effects and sometimes painful contortions of his spine and limbs. True to the origins of the monster, Chaney's creations were not meant to merely shock and repulse, but to serve, as it were, an illustration of a soul warped by hatred or greed. Sometimes Chaney's monstrosity serves as an ironic mask that hides a tender soul within. Monsters, human and otherwise, have continued to serve as symbols and teach moral lessons. From the classic horror films of the 1930s to the science fiction thrillers of the 50s to the slasher movies of the 1980s. Unfortunately, many filmmakers ignore the symbolic function of monsters and use them strictly for their unsightly appearance and shock value.
I hereby summon to this place next week every person within the sound of my voice.
By 1935, the American horror movie was already growing stale. Todd Browning pointed out the degree to which the genre had crumbled due to the lack of imagination and increasing censorship. At the climax of Mark of the Vampire, Browning reveals that the undead creatures were actually vaudeville actors hired by a clever detective. Nothing more than a cheap trick. No one noticed that the vampire had been defanged.
Watch out! They may be hovering over you, or you, or you!
In the years that followed, many filmmakers began to recapture the spirit of the early horrors, rediscovered the meanings behind the monsters. These filmmakers carry on a tradition of showing us the unthinkable, evoking the sensations of death and madness, visualizing the dark void that cannot be fathomed. They are the architects of the unknown, the designers of dread, the carpenters of darkness. They render nightmares on the screen. They inspire nightmares in our sleep. They bring us one step closer to the frightful beyond. And they open the gates to the kingdom